You might only be able to buy ammo at ranges soon if this bill goes through.
This bill is so new that we don't even have the text for it yet, but we can pretty much tell everything we need to know just by reading the title.
Well, the politicians in Washington, D.C. are at it again. They're coming for your gun rights, but this time they're going after ammunition.
So members of Congress have introduced a new bill that would effectively end online ammunition sales nationwide.
Federal legislation that, if passed, could fundamentally change the way ammunition is bought and sold in this country.
Right now, as you're watching this, there is a bill sitting in Congress that could make it a federal crime to have ammunition shipped to your front door. Not a state law, not a local ordinance, a nationwide federal ban on direct-to-consumer online ammunition sales. The bill is called the Stop Online Ammunition Sales Act of 2026, officially designated as H.R. 7166, and it was quietly introduced in late January and referred to the House Judiciary Committee. And what's inside this bill is far more extreme than most people realize. We're not talking about a minor adjustment to existing regulations here. This bill would fundamentally reshape how every single American buys ammunition, and it would turn perfectly normal, everyday purchasing behavior into something that gets flagged and reported to federal law enforcement. So let's break down exactly what this bill says, what it would do to you as a consumer, and whether it actually has any chance of surviving constitutional scrutiny. So here's what H.R. 7166 actually does at its core. The bill directly amends Title 18 of the United States Code, specifically sections 921 and 923, which are the federal statutes governing firearms licensing and commerce. What this amendment does is expand the entire federal firearms licensing framework to now include ammunition dealers. That means if you sell ammunition commercially, you would be required to obtain a federal license, just like an FFL dealer who sells firearms. And with that license comes everything that goes along with it, including ATF oversight, compliance inspections, record-keeping mandates, and the full weight of federal enforcement exposure. This is not just adding a form to fill out. This is bringing ammunition dealers under the exact same regulatory umbrella that has governed firearm sales for decades. But here's where it gets even more aggressive. The bill amends federal law to make it explicitly unlawful for any licensed importer, manufacturer, or dealer to transfer ammunition, unless that transfer happens in the physical presence of the buyer, and the dealer verifies a valid government-issued photo ID at the point of sale. Think about what that means for a second. Every single ammunition purchase in America would have to happen face-to-face. You could not order ammunition online and have it delivered to your house anymore. Even if you did find ammunition through an online retailer, the actual transfer of that ammunition would have to go through a federally licensed dealer, and you would have to show up in person with your ID to take possession. This is a nationwide in-person mandate, and it completely eliminates the way millions of Americans currently purchase their ammunition. Now, the bill doesn't stop at the point of sale. H.R. 7166 also amends Section 922A2 to place new restrictions on how ammunition can be shipped and transported across state lines. Under this new framework, shipping or transporting ammunition outside of the regulated system would itself become a violation of federal law. So this isn't just about where you buy your ammo. It's about controlling every link in the supply chain, from the manufacturer to the distributor to the retailer to the end consumer. The entire logistics network that currently allows competitive pricing and convenient access to ammunition would be disrupted under this bill. And now we get to perhaps the most alarming part of this entire bill, and this is the part that should concern every single gun owner in the country. H.R. 7166 creates a brand new subsection of federal law, under 18 U.S.C. Section 923G3, and this section establishes a mandatory reporting regime for bulk ammunition purchases. Here's how it works. If a licensed dealer sells more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition to an unlicensed person, meaning a regular consumer, either in a single transaction or across multiple purchases within 5 consecutive business days, that dealer is required by law to report the sale. And they don't just report it to one agency. The report goes to the United States Attorney General, to the state police, and to local law enforcement in the jurisdiction where the sale took place. And the report must be filed by the close of business on the day the purchase threshold is reached. Now let's put that into real-world context, because 1,000 rounds sounds like a lot to someone who doesn't shoot regularly, but it is absolutely routine for anyone who does. You could buy 500 rounds of 9mm handgun ammunition for a weekend training class, and then pick up 500 rounds of 5.56 NATO for your rifle on the same trip. And congratulations, you've just triggered a federal reporting requirement. Your name, your purchase details, and your transaction information are now being sent to multiple levels of law enforcement. Competitive shooters, people who attend multi-day training courses, hunters who stock up before season, and anyone who simply wants to buy in bulk to save money would all be swept up in this reporting net. This bill takes completely normal, completely legal consumer behavior and turns it into a reportable federal event. And that is the entire point. So the obvious question is whether any of this would survive a constitutional challenge. And this is where things get very interesting. The United States Supreme Court has already recognized in prior rulings that the Second Amendment protects not just the right to possess firearms, but also the right to acquire them. And here's the critical legal logic. Without ammunition, a firearm is essentially a paperweight. The right to keep and bear arms becomes meaningless if the government can effectively choke off access to the one thing that makes a firearm functional. That principle is going to be central to any legal challenge against this bill. Under the Supreme Court's landmark Bruen decision from 2022, the framework for evaluating Second Amendment restrictions is now rooted in historical analysis. Once a court determines that the conduct in question falls within the plain text of the Second Amendment, the burden shifts entirely to the government to demonstrate that the restriction is consistent with this nation's historical tradition of firearms regulation. And that creates enormous problems for H.R. 7166. Where is the historical tradition of banning remote ammunition purchases? Where is the founding era analog for mandatory face-to-face ID verification before you can buy a box of cartridges? Where in American history has there ever been a requirement to report bulk ammunition purchases to the federal government? The answer to all of those questions is that no such tradition exists. Outside of a handful of states like California that have implemented ammunition background checks very recently, there is simply no historical precedent for this kind of sweeping federal regulation of ammunition commerce. Now, the government would almost certainly try to argue that this is merely commercial regulation falling under Congress's Commerce Clause authority, and that argument might have had more traction before Bruen, but the post-Bruen legal landscape has made it clear that once Second Amendment conduct is burdened, historical analysis becomes the central test. Regardless of whether the regulation is framed as commercial in nature, you can't sidestep the Second Amendment just by calling something a commercial regulation if that regulation directly impacts the ability to exercise a constitutional right. Any court applying the Bruen framework honestly would have serious difficulty upholding H.R. 7166 as written. And this brings us to the bigger picture of what this bill actually represents strategically. H.R. 7166 is not really about public safety. It's about creating a backdoor restriction on ammunition access by targeting the supply chain and the transaction method rather than banning ownership outright. The strategy is clever. Instead of trying to pass an outright ammunition ban, which would face immediate and obvious constitutional challenges, this bill seeks to make ammunition so inconvenient, so regulated, and so surveilled that it produces the same chilling effect on the exercise of Second Amendment rights. Make people nervous about buying ammunition, make dealers hesitant to sell it, disrupt the supply chain that keeps prices competitive, create a surveillance apparatus around lawful purchases. The cumulative effect is designed to suppress ammunition commerce without ever having to formally ban it. And what's particularly important to understand is that modern Second Amendment doctrine, especially after Bruen, treats the right to acquire arms as being just as constitutionally protected as the right to possess them. You cannot separate the acquisition from the ownership. If the government creates barriers so high that ordinary citizens can't practically acquire ammunition, that is functionally a violation of the Second Amendment, even if no one is technically prohibited from owning it. That's the legal reality that this bill would have to confront. So the practical question everyone wants answered is whether this bill actually has any chance of becoming law. Right now, H.R. 7166 is sitting in the House Judiciary Committee, and it would need to pass through the full House of Representatives, then through the Senate, and then be signed by the President. Given the current political composition of Congress and the current occupant of the White House, the odds of this bill making it through the entire legislative process right now are extremely low. But that doesn't mean you should ignore it. Bills like this serve a purpose even when they don't pass immediately. They establish a legislative template. They signal priorities. They build institutional momentum. And if the political landscape shifts after the midterm elections, a bill that was dead on arrival today could suddenly have new life tomorrow. We've already seen this playbook executed at the state level. California implemented ammunition background checks and point-of-sale restrictions. Other states have followed with their own versions of ammunition regulation. H.R. 7166 is the federal version of that same strategy. And even if it doesn't pass this session, it signals that there is an active, organized effort to bring these restrictions to the national level. Every time a bill like this gets introduced, it normalizes the concept. It moves the Overton window, and it gives future legislators a ready-made framework to pick up and push through when the political conditions are more favorable. So to summarize everything we've covered, H.R. 7166, the Stop Online Ammunition Sales Act of 2026, does three major things. First, it ends all direct-to-consumer online ammunition sales by requiring every transfer to happen in person with photo ID verification. Second, it expands federal licensing requirements to cover ammunition dealers, bringing them under the same regulatory framework as firearms dealers. And third, it creates a federal reporting trigger for any purchase of 1,000 rounds or more, whether bought all at once or within a 5-day window, requiring dealers to notify the Attorney General, state police, and local law enforcement. This bill faces massive constitutional hurdles under the Bruen framework, but its introduction tells us exactly where the legislative pressure is heading. Stay informed, stay engaged, and understand what's at stake. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.